The recording crackles to life, pulling you into the dead hours of October night. 3 a.m. in the old section of Greyfriars, Kirkyard, Edinburgh. The microphone, left running by a paranormal investigation team, captures nothing but wind scraping against weathered headstones for nearly 2 hours. Then it comes. A howl that doesn't sound quite like any dog you've ever heard. Too deep, too deliberate, too aware. The sound rises and falls with an almost human quality of mourning, echoing between the mausoleums before cutting off with unnatural abruptness. When the investigators returned at dawn, they found their equipment undisturbed, but the battery completely drained. The recording would be their only evidence, and their last visit to that particular cemetery. What if death has guardians that we've forgotten to fear? Every civilization, separated by oceans and centuries, tells the same story with unsettling consistency. A hound at the threshold, eyes that burn with something other than reflected light. The sentinel that appears when the membrane between worlds grows thin. These are not the loyal companions we've domesticated and welcomed into our homes. These are something older, something that remembers what dogs were before we made them love us. They call them hellhounds, psychopomps, death omens. Black Shuck stalks the coastal paths of England, its eyes glowing red in the darkness. The Barghest shifts its shape in Yorkshire, never appearing the same way twice. Cu Sith hunts in silence across the Scottish Highlands, making no sound until the third bark that steals your soul. The Cadejo walks Central American roads in pairs, one white and one black, one protector and one destroyer. The Church Grim keeps its eternal vigil in graveyards across Scandinavia, the first buried, forever standing guard. These aren't just stories shared around campfires. They're warnings, passed down through generations who saw something in the dark and survived to tell their children. When you see the black dog, run. Are they still watching? We're about to find out. The morning of August 4th, 1577, began like any other Sunday in the market town of Bungay, Suffolk. Parishioners filed into St. Mary's Church for morning services, their footsteps echoing against ancient stone walls. Outside, the sky had darkened to an unnatural shade of green-black, the kind of ominous coloring that experienced farmers recognize as the herald of something far worse than ordinary rain. By 9 o'clock, the first drops had begun to fall, fat and heavy, drumming against the church's lead roof with increasing urgency. Inside the sanctuary, Reverend Abraham Fleming stood before his congregation, perhaps 50 or 60 souls gathered in their Sunday finest, when the thunder started. But this was not the distant rumbling of a typical English storm. The sound came like cannon fire, so close and violent that the very foundations of the church seemed to tremble. The air itself grew thick and oppressive, carrying with it a smell that several witnesses would later describe as brimstone or burning sulfur, an odor that the devout among them immediately associated with the presence of something infernal. What happened next would be documented in meticulous detail by Fleming himself, in a pamphlet he would publish later that same year titled A Strange and Terrible Wonder. The Reverend described how, during the height of the storm, with lightning illuminating the stained glass windows in violent flashes, a creature materialized inside the church. Not through the door, witnesses insisted, but simply appearing as if conjured from the tempest itself. It was a dog, but of such immense size and terrible aspect that calling it merely a dog seems insufficient. The beast stood as tall as a man at the shoulder, with fur blacker than the storm clouds outside, and eyes that glowed with their own internal fire, red and malevolent, casting in hellish light across the frightened faces of the congregation. The creature moved with impossible speed, covering the length of the church's central aisle in what seemed like a single bound. Its first victims were 2 parishioners kneeling in prayer. The beast fell upon them with savage fury, and according to Fleming's account, they died instantly, their necks broken or their throats torn out. The exact nature of their injuries was difficult for witnesses to articulate in the chaos and terror of the moment. A third man, positioned between the 2 victims, somehow survived the attack, but was left severely burned, his skin marked with what appeared to be scorch marks in the shape of enormous claws. These burns, witnesses swore, seemed to have been inflicted from the inside out, as if the creature's very touch carried with it some supernatural heat. The black dog turned then, surveying the panicked congregation with those burning eyes. Several people would later report that when the creature's gaze fell upon them, they felt a cold that seemed to penetrate to their very souls, a sensation of being judged and found wanting. The church's wooden beams began to smolder and char where the beast passed beneath them. The bell tower's clockwork mechanism twisted and warped, leaving the church clock forever stopped at the exact moment of the creature's appearance. Then, as suddenly as it had manifested, the beast vanished. But its rampage was not finished. 7 miles away in the coastal town of Blythburgh, at almost the exact same moment, worshippers at Holy Trinity Church experienced their own nightmare. Here, the accounts become even more detailed, preserved in parish records and multiple eyewitness testimonies. The same massive black dog, or one identical to it, crashed through the church doors with such force that the heavy oak splintered like kindling. It raced through the building with that same preternatural speed, and in its wake, 2 more parishioners lay dead and another severely injured. But at Blythburgh, the creature left behind even more tangible evidence of its presence. Deep claw marks were gouged into the ancient wooden door, marks that remain visible to this day, preserved behind protective glass for modern visitors to examine. The stone floor bore scorch marks in the pattern of massive paw prints, burned so deeply into the rock that 4 centuries of foot traffic have failed to completely erase them. Most striking of all, the tower's stonework showed damage that contemporary masons could not explain through natural means. The stones appeared to have been subjected to intense heat, yet there was no evidence of fire. Some blocks had partially melted and reformed, as if exposed to temperatures far beyond what any normal flame could produce. Reverend Fleming's published account provides specific details about the creature's appearance that would be echoed in sightings for centuries to come. He described eyes that did not merely reflect light but generated it, casting shadows in the wrong directions. He wrote of fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, making the creature difficult to look at directly, as if it were a hole cut into the fabric of reality itself. Multiple witnesses spoke of the sulfurous smell that accompanied the beast, so strong it made their eyes water and their throats burn. The creature moved, they said, with a fluidity that was wrong somehow, too fast and too smooth, like watching something that existed slightly out of phase with normal time. The deaths at both churches were investigated by local authorities, who found themselves unable to provide any natural explanation for what had occurred. The victims showed injuries consistent with animal attack, yet the churches had been secured, their doors barred from the inside against the storm. No earthly dog could have entered, let alone one of the enormous size described by witnesses. The scorch marks defied explanation entirely. They appeared neither like burns from flame nor from lightning strike, but something else altogether, something for which 16th century investigators had no frame of reference. In the days and weeks following the attacks, the legend of Black Shuck, as the creature came to be known, spread throughout East Anglia. The name itself derives from the Old English word scucka, meaning demon or devil. But farmers and fishermen along the Norfolk and Suffolk coasts already knew of such creatures. Their grandparents had spoken of massive black dogs that stalked the marshlands and beaches, omens of death that appeared before drownings and shipwrecks. What made the 1577 incidents different was the unprecedented violence and the wealth of credible witnesses, including clergy and town officials, whose testimonies could not be easily dismissed. Over the following centuries, sightings of Black Shuck continued with remarkable consistency. A 1912 account from a fisherman near Great Yarmouth describes a creature matching the 1577 descriptions almost exactly. Massive in size with glowing red eyes, and that same sulfurous smell. In 1938, a farmer near Overstrand reported his dog going mad with fear at something unseen on a country lane, only for him to glimpse an enormous black shape with eyes like hot coals before his horses bolted. A 1976 incident near Sheringham involved a family whose car inexplicably stalled on a coastal road as a massive dark shape passed in front of their headlights, moving with impossible speed. What remains striking across these accounts is not just the similarity in physical descriptions, but in the atmospheric details. Witnesses consistently report a drop in temperature despite the season, that characteristic smell of sulfur, and most tellingly, a profound sense of dread that seems disproportionate to even the appearance of a large, aggressive dog. Multiple witnesses have described feeling as if they were in the presence of something fundamentally wrong, something that should not exist within the normal order of things. Then, in 2014, archaeologists working at Leiston Abbey in Suffolk made a discovery that sent ripples through both historical and cryptozoological communities at Cadejo. During excavations of the Abbey ruins, they uncovered skeletal remains of a massive canine, far larger than any known breed of domestic dog. Initial carbon dating placed the remains in the medieval period, potentially contemporary with the earliest Black Shuck legends. The creature, when alive, would have stood over 7 feet tall on its hind legs and weighed perhaps 200 pounds. Its skull was unusually large, with eye sockets positioned more forward-facing than typical canids, giving it a disturbingly human-like gaze. Dr. Catherine Wells, a historian specializing in East Anglian folklore, has spent 30 years documenting Black Shuck sightings and analyzing historical records. She notes that descriptions of the creature have remained remarkably consistent across 4 centuries. Unusual for folklore, which typically evolves and changes with each retelling. The glowing red eyes appear in accounts from 1577 right through to 21st century sightings. The sulfurous smell is mentioned in medieval texts and in reports from the 1990s. The sense of supernatural speed and the accompanying feeling of existential dread appear with such regularity that dismissing them as mere embellishment becomes difficult. Perhaps most disturbing is the pattern that emerges when examining what happened to witnesses after their encounters. In at least 17 documented cases, people who claim to have seen Black Shuck died within a year of the sighting. A 1923 case from Clay next the sea involved a respected solicitor who reported seeing the creature on a beach at dawn. He described it in his diary with precise detail, noting particularly the way its eyes seemed to look not at him but through him, and how he felt marked somehow by that gaze. He died 7 months later in a drowning accident, despite being a strong swimmer familiar with local tides. In 1967, a schoolteacher from Blakeney saw what she described as Black Shuck crossing her garden at dusk. Her account mentioned the red eyes and the overwhelming smell of sulfur. She died of a heart attack 3 months later, despite being only 42 years old with no history of cardiac problems. The question that has haunted researchers is whether Black Shuck is a death omen, appearing to those who are already fated to die, or whether the encounter itself somehow brings about death, making the creature not merely a herald, but an active agent of mortality. Local historians remain divided. Some argue that the creature appears as a warning, giving those it visits time to prepare for their imminent death, a dark mercy perhaps. Others believe that to see Black Shuck is to be marked for death, that the creature's appearance is not prediction but sentence, a supernatural targeting that ensures the witness's doom. The scorch marks at Blythburgh Church remain, protected now, but still visible, still defying easy explanation, after more than 400 years. On certain nights, particularly during thunderstorms, locals claim you can still smell sulfur in the church, and that the temperature drops noticeably in the spots where the creature's burning paws touched stone. Whether such phenomena represent genuine supernatural residue, or the power of suggestion remains unclear, but the reports persist nonetheless, adding new layers to a legend that refuses to fade with time. The Barghest does not stay still. It does not hold one shape. It does not offer the mercy of recognition. This is perhaps the most profound terror it brings to those who encounter it in the windswept valleys and fog-choked streets of Yorkshire. A creature that refuses to be pinned down, that slips between forms like water between fingers, denies the human mind its most basic defense against fear, the ability to identify and therefore prepare for danger. In the narrow limestone gorge known as Troller's Gill, where the rock walls rise like cathedral spires and the stream chatters over stones worn smooth by centuries, the Barghest has been seen in at least 7 different forms. Locals claim that the creature favors this particular location because it is itself a threshold, a place between the high moors and the valley floor, a crack in the landscape where the ordinary world grows thin. Hikers who venture into the gill during the hours between sunset and full darkness speak of seeing a hound, the size of a carthorse, blocking the path ahead, its eyes burning with a cold blue flame that casts no warmth, no real light, only a sickly phosphorescence that makes the surrounding shadows seem somehow deeper. The creature's breath, witnesses say, creates clouds of vapor that hang in the air long after it has moved, clouds that smell of standing water and turned earth. But approach this massive hound or turn to flee from it, and the Barghest reveals its most disturbing characteristic. It changes. Not gradually, not with any transitional phase that might allow the mind to adjust, but instantly, impossibly. Where a moment before stood a beast that dwarfed any natural wolf or dog, now crouches a white rabbit, perfectly ordinary in every detail except for those same burning blue eyes. The rabbit sits motionless on the path, and every instinct bred into human beings over millennia of domesticating these gentle creatures says to approach, to reach out, perhaps to help what appears to be a lost pet. This is the trap. Those who follow the rabbit find themselves led deeper into the gill, farther from the safety of open ground, drawn along switchback paths and across loose scree until they stand at the edge of a 40-foot drop, or find themselves cornered where the gorge narrows to barely shoulder width. Then the rabbit is gone, and in its place stands something that defies easy description. Some witnesses from the late 1800s spoke of a headless man in old-fashioned clothing, his neck ending in a ragged stump, his arms outstretched as if groping blindly. Others insisted they saw something neither fully animal nor human, something that walked upright but had too many joints in its limbs, that moved with a lurching, unnatural gait. The details change from account to account, but the core experience remains constant. The victim realizes too late that they have been following death itself, that the innocent rabbit was merely a mask worn by something far older and far less merciful than any natural predator. The streets of Leeds, particularly in the older districts where the original medieval road system still dictates the pattern of modern traffic, have their own clusters of Barghest sightings. The creature seems drawn to bridges and crossroads, those liminal spaces where paths intersect and choices must be made. On Crown Point Bridge, which spans the River Aire, at least 17 documented encounters occurred between 1800 and 1900. Mill workers walking home in the pre-dawn darkness, shopkeepers closing up late at night, travelers arriving by coach or train, all reported seeing a black hound of enormous size appear without warning at the center of the bridge. The bridge is significant in Celtic tradition. It represents transition, the crossing from one state or place to another, and such thresholds were believed to be guarded by entities that tested travelers, that determined who might pass and who must pay a price. The Barghest, scholars of folklore suggest, may be a remnant of these ancient threshold guardians, a creature whose very purpose is to haunt the in-between places where the boundary between worlds grows permeable. Crossroads hold similar power. They represent choice, decision, the splitting of one path into many possibilities. And it is at crossroads throughout the older parts of Leeds that the Barghest appears most frequently, forcing late-night travelers to confront a decision. Turn back or attempt to pass the creature and reach their destination. One account from 1825 stands out for its detail and the psychological horror it conveys. Thomas Wainwright, a wool merchant who lived in the Headingley district, kept a diary that survived in the archives of the Leeds Library. His entries from October of that year describe an ordeal that lasted 3 consecutive nights, an experience that cost him his peace of mind and, ultimately, his brother's life. On the first night, Wainwright wrote, he encountered a large dog near the crossroads where the Otley Road met Woodhouse Lane. The dog was black, shaggy, and unremarkable except for its size, which he compared to that of a young calf. It sat directly in the center of the intersection, watching him approach. When Wainwright reached a distance of perhaps 20 feet, he raised his walking stick and shouted at the animal to move. The dog stood, and in the movement, Wainwright realized it was far larger than he had initially perceived. It had been sitting hunched, he wrote, as if trying to appear smaller than it truly was. Now, at its full height, its back reached his chest. The creature turned and walked away, vanishing into the darkness beyond the gas lamps. The second night, Wainwright deliberately chose a different route home, taking Clarendon Road instead, a detour that added half an hour to his journey. Yet when he reached the junction with Ash Road, the same black hound stood waiting. Except it was not the same, not exactly. This creature was even larger, its shoulder now level with Wainwright's eyes. And its proportions seemed somehow wrong, the legs too long, the body too lean, the skull too narrow. It watched him with what Wainwright described as an expression of satisfaction, as if it had expected him, as if his attempt to avoid it had been anticipated and overcome. Again, when he shouted and advanced, the creature retreated, melting into the shadows between buildings. On the third night, Wainwright brought 2 friends with him, both armed with pistols. They walked together along his usual route, speaking loudly, projecting confidence they did not feel. At the original crossroads where he had first seen the hound, nothing appeared. They continued on, and Wainwright began to hope that company had been the solution, that the creature, whatever it was, had been discouraged by numbers. Then, less than 100 yards from his own front door, all 3 men saw it simultaneously. The Barghest stood in the middle of the street, and it had grown to monstrous proportions. Its back now rose higher than the tallest of the 3 men, its head level with the first-floor windows of the surrounding houses. Its eyes, Wainwright wrote, were no longer the eyes of any dog. They were too intelligent, too aware, filled with what he could only describe as malevolent glee. One of his companions raised his pistol and fired. The shot was true, striking the creature in the chest. The Barghest did not flinch, did not bleed, did not acknowledge the impact in any way. Instead, it opened its mouth, revealing teeth like butcher's knives, and laughed. Wainwright was adamant on this point in his diary. The creature laughed with a sound that was not quite animal and not quite human, a sound that carried within it the suggestion of words just beyond comprehension. The 3 men fled. They reached Wainwright's house and barricaded themselves inside, watching through the windows as the enormous black shape circled the property until dawn. When morning came, the Barghest was gone. Wainwright's brother, who lived in Bradford and whom Thomas had not seen in weeks, was found dead that same morning, killed when his horse reared for no apparent reason and threw him against a stone wall. The timing, the connection, could have been coincidence. Wainwright did not believe it was. He became convinced that the Barghest had been marking him, stalking him, growing larger each night to demonstrate its power and to announce an impending death. When the death came, it struck not Wainwright himself, but someone close to him, as if to prove that the creature's reach extended beyond simple physical presence. This pattern of the Barghest growing larger over successive encounters appears in multiple historical accounts. The size manipulation seems to serve several purposes. Initially, the creature may appear relatively normal, allowing witnesses to rationalize what they are seeing as merely an unusually large stray dog. This lowers defenses, prevents immediate flight. But with each subsequent sighting, the impossible nature of the entity becomes undeniable. The creature is demonstrating that it exists outside natural law, that it is not bound by the physical limitations that govern ordinary animal. More than that, the escalating size suggests escalating threat, a countdown to some inevitable catastrophe. The psychological impact of facing a creature that refuses to maintain consistent form cannot be overstated. Human beings navigate the world by pattern recognition, by building mental catalogs of threat and safety. We learn what a wolf looks like, what behavior precedes an attack, how to identify danger and respond appropriately. The Barghest destroys this security. It might be a white rabbit, harmless and small. It might be a headless man, frightening but still bound by human limitations. It might be a monstrous hound that dwarfs horses. There is no way to prepare, no defense that can account for every possible manifestation. The victim is kept in a state of constant uncertainty, unable to trust their own perceptions, unable to distinguish the genuinely dangerous from the deceptively innocent. Modern encounters suggest the Barghest has not faded into mere historical curiosity. During the 1990s, a cluster of reports emerged from motorists traveling the remote roads that cross the North York Moor. The A169, which runs between Pickering and Whitby, gained particular notoriety after at least 8 drivers reported similar experiences over a 3-year period. The accounts describe driving alone at night, often in fog or heavy rain, when an animal appears in the headlights. Most witnesses initially thought they were seeing a large dog or deer standing in the road. They braked, sometimes swerved, attempting to avoid hitting what appeared to be a living creature. As their vehicles slowed or stopped, the animal changed. In some accounts, it grew rapidly until it towered over the car, forcing the driver to stare upward through the windshield at something impossibly massive. In others, it shifted form entirely, becoming something the witnesses struggled to describe in their later reports to police and newspapers. One driver insisted it became a crouching man with the head of a bull. Another said it looked like a dog walking on its hind legs, its front limbs too long, and ending in something resembling human hands. All of the witnesses described the same terrible certainty, that the creature was aware of them, that it was studying them, and that they had been marked in some way. These modern accounts carry an additional dimension of terror because they occur within the supposed safety of a vehicle, that metal and glass barrier between humans and the natural world. The Barghest violates this sanctuary not by physical attack, but by its mere presence, by demonstrating that locks and doors and steel frames mean nothing against an entity that can alter its very substance. The witnesses were left unharmed physically, but the psychological scars remained. Several refused to drive that stretch of road again, even in daylight. One sold his car entirely, unable to sit behind the wheel without reliving the moment when something impossible stared at him through the windshield. The connection to ancient Celtic threshold guardians provides a framework for understanding the Barghest's behavior. These entities were never meant to be simple monsters, not beasts to be fought or fled. They existed to remind travelers that crossing from one place to another, moving from the known to the unknown, carried inherent risk and required respect. The guardian tested worthiness, measured intent, and sometimes demanded tribute or sacrifice. The Barghest, viewed through this lens, is not hunting for food or sport. It is fulfilling an ancient function, appearing at bridges and crossroads and lonely stretches of road where the journey itself becomes more important than the destination. It manifests to force a confrontation with uncertainty, with the reality that not all journeys end safely, that some thresholds exact a price for passage. The shape-shifting aspect makes perfect sense in this context. A true threshold guardian cannot be predicted or prepared for, because the very nature of crossing a threshold is to move into the unknown. The Barghest takes the form most appropriate to test each specific traveler. For some, it is the lure of the vulnerable rabbit. For others, it is the intimidating mass of the giant hound. For still others, it is the disturbing wrongness of the headless man or the hybrid creatures that defy classification. Each manifestation reveals something about the witness, exposes what they fear or what tempts them, what makes them hesitate or flee or press forward despite terror. Whether the Barghest is a remnant of Celtic belief given flesh, a collective hallucination born from isolation and darkness, or something else entirely remains unresolved. What cannot be disputed is the consistency of the core experience across centuries and the profound effect it has on those who encounter it. The Barghest does not simply frighten. It destabilizes, it unmoors, it forces those who see it to question the reliability of their own senses and the fundamental nature of the world they thought they understood. In a creature that is never the same thing twice, Yorkshire has birthed a perfect manifestation of existential dread, a reminder that some things refuse to be known, categorized, or escaped. In the mist-shrouded glens of the Scottish Highlands, where shadows pool between ancient stone walls and the wind carries whispers of older times, there exists a terror that moves without sound. This is not the howling beast of common nightmares, not the slavering wolf that announces its presence with snarls and growls. This is something far more sinister, something that defies the natural order in ways that have haunted Highland communities for countless generations. The Cu Sith hunts in absolute silence, and that silence is what makes it uniquely, unforgettably terrifying. Traditional Scottish folklore describes the Cu Sith as a creature roughly the size of a large calf or yearling bull, massive beyond any natural hound. But size alone does not account for the dread it inspired across the Highlands. What marks the Cu Sith as something otherworldly, something fundamentally wrong, is its coloration. Witnesses across centuries have described it with remarkable consistency as dark green, not the green of living plants or healthy moss, but a shadowy, murky green, like deep water beneath ice, like the color of things that grow in caves away from sunlight. This was no natural hue for any living creature. In Highland tradition, this specific shade of green marked the Cu Sith as a being of the otherworld, that liminal realm that exists alongside our own. separated by barriers thinner than most would care to believe. The folklore surrounding the Cu Sith splits into two distinct origin stories, both equally dark. Some Highland traditions hold that the Cu Sith was a fairy hound, a creature that belonged to the Side, those dangerous and unpredictable beings who ruled the otherworld. These fairy hounds served as hunters for their masters, crossing into the mortal realm on specific nights to gather what the city required. But other versions of the legend tell a more vengeful tale. According to these accounts, the Cu Sith was the ghost of a murdered hunting dog, a faithful companion betrayed and killed by human hands, now returned with purpose, twisted by rage and the corruption of death. This spectral hound sought not merely revenge against its killer, but a broader retribution against all humanity, hunting souls as it had once hunted game in life. What united both versions was the Cu Sith's method of hunting. It moved through the highlands in complete silence, its massive paws making no sound on stone or heather, its breathing creating no mist in cold air, its passage disturbing not even the smallest branch or blade of grass. Shepherds working alone in remote glens, travelers caught between villages at twilight, anyone who found themselves isolated and vulnerable might suddenly become aware of a presence. Not through sound, but through that primitive sense that tells us when we are being watched, when we are no longer alone. And when victims turned to look, when they scanned the moorland or peered into the gathering darkness between stone walls, they might catch a glimpse of something huge and dark green, something that should not exist, watching them with eyes that held neither the warmth of a living animal nor the blankness of a natural predator, but something calculating and hungry in ways that had nothing to do with flesh. The Cu Sith did not hunt for meat. It hunted for souls. According to Highland tradition, the creature sought to steal away the spirits of the living, to drag them back across the boundary into the otherworld. And the mechanism of this theft, the method by which the Cu Sith claimed its victims, has been passed down through generations with grim consistency. The silent stalking would continue until the hound was ready to claim its prey. Then, and only then, would the Cu Sith break its terrible silence. It would bark 3 times. Just 3 times. And these were not ordinary barks, not the sounds a natural dog might make. Witnesses who survived described them as impossibly deep, resonating not just through the air, but through the ground itself, through stone and bone, barks that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, that bypassed the ears entirely and struck directly at something deeper, something primal. The rule was absolute and unforgiving. After the first bark, the victim had until the 3rd bark to reach safety. Safety meant threshold spaces, places of protection, the interior of a home or church, anywhere that represented sanctuary. If someone heard the first bark and began running, heard the 2nd bark drawing closer, gaining on them, they had only seconds to reach shelter before the 3rd bark came. And if that 3rd bark sounded before they crossed into protected space, the Cu Sith would claim them. Their soul would be ripped away, dragged back into the other world, leaving behind a body that might still breathe and walk, but was fundamentally hollow, fundamentally gone. The horror of this hunting method lies not in violence, but in the mathematics of hope and despair. 1 bark is a warning, 2 barks is escalation, but 3 barks is finality. A person might hear the first bark and freeze, unable to determine direction or distance. By the 2nd bark, panic would set in, but which way to run? Where was safety? How far away? And the knowledge that only 1 more bark separated life from something worse than death would transform rational thought into pure terror. Some folklore accounts describe people who dropped dead of fear alone, their hearts giving out after hearing the 2nd bark, unable to bear waiting for the 3rd. In isolated Highland communities, particularly in the centuries before modern settlement patterns changed traditional life, the Cu Sith was not merely a story told to frighten children. It was a genuine concern that shaped protective practices and rituals. Documentary evidence from parish records and collected oral histories reveals that families performed specific ceremonies to guard the most vulnerable members of their communities from the Cu Sith's hunt. Newborn infants, not yet strong enough to have firmly grasped their own souls, were considered especially susceptible. For the first weeks of life, Highland mothers would maintain constant vigilance, keeping the child within the home, ensuring that threshold spaces were marked with protective symbols. Some communities burned specific woods, whose smoke was believed to confuse or repel creatures from the otherworld. Others relied on iron, that metal which folklore across cultures associates with protection against supernatural threats. The dying posed another category of vulnerability. As a person's grasp on life weakened, as the boundary between their soul and body became more permeable, the Cu Sith was believed to draw near, sensing opportunity. Deathbed vigils in Highland tradition served multiple purposes. Yes, they provided comfort and witnessed final words, but they also served as protection, a guard against the Cu Sith and other soul-hunting entities. Multiple people maintaining watch, keeping candles lit, ensuring the dying person remained within consecrated or protected space, until death came naturally and the soul could depart to its proper destination, rather than being stolen away. These were not occasional practices performed by the especially superstitious. Parish records from the 1800s and earlier indicate these protective rituals were standard practice across Highland communities. The Cu Sith was treated as a genuine threat requiring genuine precautions. Ministers occasionally complained in their records about parishioners mixing Christian burial rites with what the clergy considered pagan protective measures, but the people maintained their traditions nonetheless. When you live in isolation, when the nearest neighbor might be miles away across difficult terrain, when night comes early and stays late for much of the year, you take seriously whatever might hunt in darkness. The archaeological evidence adds another layer to understanding Highland beliefs about canine spirits. Throughout Scotland, particularly at sites dating from the Iron Age through medieval periods, researchers have documented ritual dog burials at threshold location. Dogs interred at property boundaries, at the entrances to settlements, beneath doorways, at crossroads. These are not casual burials, not simply dead animals disposed of conveniently. The positioning is too deliberate, too consistent across different sites and time periods. These represent intentional ritual practice, and the most compelling interpretation connects them to protection against supernatural canine threats. In folklore logic, like protects against light, a dog buried at a threshold might serve as a guardian against other dogs, including spectral ones. The spirit of the buried animal would claim that threshold as its territory, warning away or fighting against other canine entities that attempted to cross. Some scholars interpret these burials as creating a permanent guardian, a faithful dog serving even in death. Others suggest the burials might represent a kind of sympathetic magic, a physical marker that said, this place is already claimed by a dog spirit, a friendly one, and thus hostile spirits must seek elsewhere. The consistency of this practice across centuries suggests the belief in threatening canine spirits was no brief superstition, but a persistent element of Scottish spiritual landscape. The Cu Sith and entities like it were considered real enough, threatening enough, that communities invested significant effort into protection. And these were practical people, farmers and herders and craftspeople, who could not afford to waste time or resources on empty gestures. If they buried dogs at thresholds, if they performed rituals to protect infants and the dying, if they taught their children to recognize the signs of the Cu Sith and to know what the three barks meant, they did so because they believed the threat was genuine. The Cu Sith endures in Highland folklore, not because it is the most violent legendary creature, not because it tears victims apart or leaves spectacular evidence of its hunts. It endures because it embodies a particular species of terror, one rooted in silence and inevitability. The silence means no warning, no chance to prepare, only sudden awareness that something has been stalking you, has chosen you, has already closed the distance. And the three barks represent the cruel gift of hope measured in seconds, the knowledge that survival is possible but improbable, that you have just enough time to run, but likely not enough time to reach safety. It is the mathematics of doom, counted out in three resonant calls from a creature that should not exist, wearing a color no living thing should possess, hunting for something far more precious than flesh and blood. The road from San Salvador to the coastal towns winds through mountain passes, where streetlights end and the darkness becomes something tangible, something that presses against the windows of passing cars. It was on such a road in 2017 that Marco Antonio Ruiz experienced what he describes as the most terrifying night of his life, though he remains uncertain to this day whether he was saved or merely spared. Marco had stayed late at his cousin's wedding in a small village outside the capital. The celebration had run past midnight, and despite warnings from elderly relatives, he decided to drive home rather than wait until morning. He knew the road well, had traveled it dozens of times. But familiarity, as he would learn, offers no protection against what walks in the Central American night. He first noticed the dog in his rearview mirror about 20 minutes into the drive. It appeared suddenly on the empty road behind him, illuminated by his taillights. The animal was massive, easily the size of a calf, and it moved with an unnatural gait that made Marco slow his vehicle. As his speed decreased, he saw what made the movement so wrong. The creature's feet made a distinct clicking sound on the pavement, a sharp percussion that echoed off the canyon walls. These were not paws touching the road. They were hooves. The dog's eyes reflected red in his brake lights, burning like embers in the darkness. Marco accelerated, his heart hammering, but when he checked the mirror again, the creature was closer. Not running, not even moving quickly by any logic he could understand, but simply nearer than it had been. He pressed the accelerator to the floor, taking curves at dangerous speeds, but distance seemed meaningless. The dog maintained its position, always just at the edge of his taillights, those red eyes unwavering. Then, on a particularly sharp turn, the creature moved. It didn't run past his car, but rather appeared alongside his driver's side window, keeping perfect pace at nearly 90 kilometers per hour. Marco forced himself to look. The dog was white, its fur seeming to glow with a pale luminescence that had nothing to do with his headlights. Its eyes, which he had thought were reflecting red, were actually burning from within. And its feet, he could now clearly see, were cloven hooves like those of a goat or cow. In his panic, Marco nearly missed the turn ahead. At the last possible second, the white dog moved in front of his car, forcing him to brake hard. His vehicle slid to a stop mere meters from where the road simply ended. A landslide had swept away the bridge he had been approaching at full speed. In the darkness, without streetlights, he would never have seen it in time. The white dog sat at the edge of the broken road, watching him with those burning eyes. Then it turned and walked into the forest, its hooves clicking against stone until the sound faded into silence. Marco's experience touches the heart of the Cadejo legend, a supernatural tradition that spans Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. But his account raises the question that has haunted travelers for centuries. Was he saved by the white Cadejo, the protective spirit that guards those who walk the night roads? Or was he saved from the black Cadejo, a demonic force that the white spirit had intercepted? And most unsettling of all, how can anyone be certain which Cadejo they have encountered until it's far too late? The legend speaks of two spirit dogs, twins born of the same supernatural origin, but representing opposing forces. The white Cadejo is said to protect solitary travelers, particularly drunkards and those foolish enough to walk alone after dark. It appears as an enormous dog with glowing white fur, eyes that burn red or sometimes blue, and hooves instead of paws. Despite its monstrous appearance, the white Cadejo is considered a guardian, a protector against the dangers of the night. The black Cadejo is its dark mirror, identical in form, but draped in fur the color of a moonless night. This creature appears to lead travelers astray. Some accounts claim it drives people toward cliffs, into rivers, or in more modern times, into the paths of oncoming vehicles. Other stories suggest it simply follows, driving victims mad with terror until they collapse or flee into even greater danger. But the legend's true horror lies not in the existence of these two spirits, but in the terrible ambiguity between them. In the darkness, when you hear the click of hooves on pavement behind you, when you see those burning eyes in the shadows, how do you know which Cadejo has chosen to walk with you? In 2009, a woman named Esperanza Morales from the highlands of Guatemala reported an encounter that illustrates this terrifying uncertainty. She was returning from her job cleaning offices in Guatemala City, taking a late bus that dropped her several kilometers from her village. The walk home required crossing a wooden bridge over a deep ravine. She had made this walk hundreds of times. That night, she heard the footsteps behind her. Not the soft pad of dog paws, but the sharp, rhythmic click of something hard striking the dirt road. She turned and saw an enormous black dog, its eyes glowing yellow in the moonlight. Esperanza did what her grandmother had taught her. She prayed and continued walking without running, without showing fear. The dog followed her for nearly 3 kilometers, never approaching closer, never falling behind. Its breathing was audible, a deep huffing sound that seemed too large to come from any natural animal. When she reached the bridge, the dog suddenly moved, racing past her and positioning itself at the center of the wooden structure. It stood there, blocking her path, its eyes fixed on her face. Esperanza stopped. Every instinct told her to turn back, to find another route, to run. But another way home would add hours to her journey through even more isolated terrain. She began to pray again, louder this time, and took a step toward the bridge. The dog growled, a sound she said made her bones ache. She stopped again. They remained in this standoff for what she estimates was 10 or 15 minutes, though she admits time felt distorted. Then, from the darkness of the ravine below, she heard movement. Something large was climbing the ravine wall, something that grunted and scraped against stone. The black Cadejo's attention shifted to the sound. Without warning, it turned and leaped from the bridge into the darkness below. The sounds that followed, Esperanza refuses to describe in detail. She speaks only of howling, of something screaming that sounded neither animal nor human, and of a terrible thrashing that shook the bridge beneath her feet. Then, silence. She ran across the bridge and didn't stop running until she reached her village. The next morning, men from the village went to investigate. They found deep gouges in the wooden posts of the bridge, marks that looked like they had been made by enormous claws or teeth. In the ravine below, the vegetation was torn and scattered, and there were traces of blood, though no body was ever found. The men also found tracks, both in the soft earth near the bridge and in the ravine itself. Some were the prints of large paws. Others were unmistakably hooves. Was the black Cadejo blocking Esperanza from danger in the ravine below? Or was the white Cadejo fighting the black one to protect her? The tracks suggested both creatures had been present, but Esperanza had only seen one. The ambiguity torments her to this day. This moral and visual uncertainty reflects the syncretic origins of the Cadejo legend itself. The story represents a blending of indigenous Central American beliefs with Spanish colonial Catholicism, creating something that belongs fully to neither tradition, but speaks powerfully to both. Indigenous peoples of Central America held complex beliefs about animal spirits and shapeshifters, creatures that existed in liminal spaces between the human world and the realm of gods and ancestors. Dogs held particular significance as guides and guardians, creatures that could move between worlds. When Spanish colonizers arrived with their Catholic framework of angels and demons, saints and devils, these beliefs didn't disappear. Instead, they merged, adapted, and evolved. The result was the Cadejo, a creature that embodies Catholic dualism, the eternal struggle between good and evil, guardian angel and demon, but filtered through indigenous understanding of the spirit world. The Cadejo doesn't fit neatly into European categories. It's neither wholly natural nor supernatural, neither completely benevolent nor entirely malevolent. It exists in the spaces between certainties, in the shadows where categorical thinking breaks down. This ambiguity serves a social function in rural Central American communities. The Cadejo legend enforces nighttime curfews without relying on parental or religious authority alone. It addresses the very real dangers of traveling alone after dark, robberies, accidents, wild animals, but frames them in terms of a spiritual test. The person who encounters the Cadejo and survives doesn't just escape physical danger, but proves something about their moral character. Yet the accounts keep coming, and they resist simple dismissal as cautionary tales or moral fables. The details are too specific, too consistent across regions and generations. The hooves appear in nearly every account: the burning eyes, the enormous size, the uncanny ability to appear and disappear without logical explanation. In 2015, a truck driver named Roberto Castillo reported an encounter on the highway between Tegucigalpa and San Pedro Sula in Honduras. He was hauling freight on a route he had driven for 8 years, always overnight to avoid traffic. Around 2 in the morning, his headlights caught something on the road ahead. A white dog, massive in size, sat directly in the center of his lane. Roberto honked his horn. The dog didn't move. He slowed down, expecting the animal to flee at the last moment. Instead, It stood and began walking ahead of his truck, maintaining a constant distance of perhaps 10 meters. This continued for several kilometers. Roberto tried to pass, but every time he pulled into the other lane, the dog moved to block him. When he slowed down, the dog slowed. When he accelerated, it somehow maintained the pace despite moving at what appeared to be a casual walk. Then Roberto's headlights illuminated the obstacle ahead. A commercial bus had broken down in the road, completely blocking both lanes on a blind curve. The driver had set out warning triangles, but they were inadequate, nearly invisible until you were dangerously close. Roberto braked hard, his truck sliding but stopping just meters from a collision that would certainly have killed him, and possibly the bus passengers. When his truck stopped, the white dog was gone. Roberto searched with his spotlight, walked the road calling out, though he's not sure why. He found the hoofprints in the dust at the road's edge, each one perfectly formed and impossibly deep, as though something tremendously heavy had passed by. These modern accounts suggest the Cadejo hasn't faded with electrification and highways, hasn't retreated before cell phones and GPS. If anything, contemporary witnesses report encounters with even greater frequency, perhaps because more people now travel the roads at night, or perhaps because the boundary between the everyday world and the realm of spirits remains as permeable as ever. In rural areas throughout Central America, the Cadejo remains a living presence, not a folkloric curiosity, but an active concern. People plan their travel around avoiding nighttime journeys. Parents warn children with genuine fear in their voices. Communities share new accounts of encounters, debating their meaning, trying to determine which Cadejo was seen and what it portends. The legend persists because it addresses something fundamental about the experience of being alone in darkness, vulnerable and far from help. It gives form to the primal fear that something is watching, something is following, something with intentions we cannot know. And it offers no easy comfort, no simple protection. You cannot ward off the Cadejo with charms or prayers alone. You cannot outrun it. You can only endure the encounter and hope that the eyes burning in the darkness belong to the guardian and not the demon. Or perhaps hope that you never learn the difference. In the summer of 1993, restoration workers at a small parish church in Suffolk began excavating beneath the threshold of the main entrance, preparing to repair the medieval stonework that had begun to buckle after 6 centuries. What they found embedded in the hard-packed earth stopped the project entirely. Curled in a hollow directly beneath where thousands of footsteps had crossed into sacred ground, they discovered the complete skeleton of a large black dog. Its bones had been carefully arranged, deliberately positioned with its skull facing outward toward the world beyond the church walls. The workers, some of whom had grown up in the village, immediately recognized what they had disturbed. This was not simply an animal burial. This was a church grim, a guardian placed there intentionally when the foundations were first laid, sentenced to an eternity of supernatural watch duty, protecting the living and the dead within. The custom of burying black dogs in church foundations represents one of the darkest chapters in European folk practice, a tradition that blurred the line between protection and sacrifice, between devotion and horror. Archaeological evidence from Britain and Scandinavia has revealed dozens of these deliberate burials, each one telling the same unsettling story. These animals were not beloved pets laid to rest in consecrated ground. They were offerings, magical insurance policies, purchased with innocent lives, transformed through ritual and belief into something between the living and the dead. The practice emerged from a widespread belief about the first burial in any new churchyard. According to folk tradition stretching back to pre-Christian times, the first soul interred in hallowed ground would be claimed by darker forces, doomed to serve as an eternal guardian for all the souls that followed. This first spirit would never find rest, never move on to whatever afterlife awaited. Instead, it would be bound to patrol the churchyard through every night until the end of time, watching over the graves, warning the parish of impending deaths, driving away evil spirits and malevolent entities that might disturb the consecrated earth. The thought of a human soul suffering this fate was considered unbearable. So communities developed a grim solution. They would bury a black dog first. The color was crucial. Black dogs held special significance in Northern European folklore, creatures already associated with death omens, supernatural boundaries, and the spaces between worlds. By choosing a black dog for this terrible honor, Communities believed they were selecting an animal already attuned to the spirit realm, something that might more easily bridge the gap between life and death. Some accounts suggest the dogs were buried alive, their final moments of terror and confusion somehow necessary to bind them properly to their eternal duty. Other sources indicate the animals were ritually killed at the foundation ceremony, their blood mixed with the mortar, their bodies positioned with specific prayers or incantations, meant to transform them from simple animals into supernatural protectors. The archaeological record provides chilling confirmation. At a church in Denmark, excavators found 3 black dog skeletons positioned at precise intervals around the foundation perimeter, forming what researchers believe was a protective triangle. Each animal had been placed in a stone-lined hollow, suggesting elaborate preparation rather than casual burial. In Yorkshire, a Victorian renovation uncovered a dog skeleton beneath every corner of the church, 4 animals positioned to guard the cardinal directions. The bones showed no signs of disease or injury, indicating these were healthy animals deliberately killed. At a medieval church in Norfolk, workers found a black dog buried upright beneath the doorway, its skeleton still maintaining that sitting position after 500 years, as though it had been trained to wait there and simply never stop. The most disturbing discoveries came from churches where multiple dog burials were found. These were not simultaneous placements, but sequential additions, suggesting that as the original guardian weakened or failed, new ones were added to reinforce the protection. At one site in Sweden, researchers found 7 black dog skeletons layered in the same foundation corner, each one separated by roughly a century of soil accumulation. The implication was clear. Either the community believed these spiritual guardians wore out and needed replacement, or something was destroying them, something that required constant reinforcement of the magical barrier. But did the ritual work? Did these sacrificed animals truly become supernatural protectors? Or did the belief alone create something just as powerful? The accounts of church grim encounters suggest that something indeed manifested from these burials, something that witnesses consistently described across centuries and cultures with remarkable similarity. These were not friendly apparitions. They were massive black dogs, larger than any natural breed, with eyes described as glowing red or burning like coals. They appeared most often at night, patrolling the boundaries of churchyards with purposeful deliberation, following routes around the perimeter with the regularity of a guard making rounds. In 1876, the parish register of a church in Cumbria recorded an account from the sexton who served there for 40 years. He claimed that, on the night before any death in the parish, he would see the church grim. It would appear at dusk, emerging from the base of the church tower where foundation excavations had previously revealed dog bones. The creature would walk slowly through the graveyard to the spot where the next burial would occur, and there it would dig, scraping at the earth with massive paws as though preparing the grave itself. By morning, there would be no physical evidence, no disturbed soil, but within days, someone from the parish would die, and their grave would be dug in precisely that location. The phenomenon of phantom bell ringing proved even more unsettling. Numerous churches across Britain and Scandinavia reported incidents where church bells would ring in the middle of the night with no human agency. Witnesses who investigated found the bell ropes swinging, the bells still resonating, but the church completely empty. The traditional explanation blamed the church grim, suggesting the guardian spirit was sounding an alarm, warning of approaching danger or impending death. In some accounts, witnesses claimed to see a massive black dog in the bell tower, standing on its hind legs with the rope somehow grasped in its jaws or manipulated through sheer supernatural will. A particularly detailed account comes from a church in Lancashire in the 1920s. The vicar and 3 parishioners responded to the sound of vigorous bell ringing at 2 in the morning. They arrived to find the church doors still locked from the outside. No signs of forced entry, but the bells continuing to ring with increasing intensity. When they opened the door, they reported seeing a large black dog standing in the nave, illuminated by moonlight streaming through the windows. The animal watched them for what felt like an eternity, its eyes reflecting the light with an unnatural brightness, before it turned and walked directly through the stone wall beside the altar. The bells stopped the moment the creature vanished. The next morning, they received word that one of the parish's oldest members had died at approximately 2 in the morning, at the exact time the bells began ringing. But beneath these protective functions lurked a darker question that troubled both believers and skeptics. Were these church grims willing guardians or imprisoned victims? The folk practices that created them involved no consent, no voluntary sacrifice. These were animals captured, killed, and bound through ritual to an eternal obligation. If the legends held any truth, if consciousness or spirit truly persisted after death, then what the communities created were not guardians but slaves. Trapped souls forced into service, unable to rest, unable to do anything but patrol and warn and protect for century after century. This horror became particularly acute during church restoration projects. Workers who disturbed the foundation burials frequently reported unsettling experiences that suggested they had awakened something that had been mercifully dormant. At a church in Northumberland in 2004, contractors removing old flagstones discovered a dog skeleton in a foundation cavity. Within hours of the discovery, 3 separate workers reported seeing a large black dog in their peripheral vision, always vanishing when they turned to look directly. One worker claimed the animal appeared in his car's rearview mirror as he drove home that evening, sitting in the back seat, watching him with luminous eyes. When he jerked around to look, nothing was there. The sightings continued throughout the restoration project, ceasing only after the local vicar performed a blessing ceremony, and the dog's remains were reinterred with what he described as a prayer of release. Similar incidents occurred at a Scottish church in 2011. The restoration team uncovered not 1 but 2 black dog skeletons beneath the foundation stones. That night, the site foreman heard what he described as scratching and whimpering coming from inside the church, sounds he initially attributed to a trapped animal. Investigation revealed no living creature, but the sounds continued, night after night, always starting after sunset and continuing until dawn. Workers began refusing night shifts. One contractor, pressed to explain his refusal, finally admitted he had seen something moving in the darkness of the partially demolished nave, something large and dog-shaped that seemed to be trying desperately to escape but could not pass beyond the church's physical boundaries. The project concluded months behind schedule, and locals reported increased church grim sightings for years afterward, as though the disturbance had somehow strengthened or agitated whatever presence remained. The psychological weight of this tradition extends beyond simple ghost stories. These practices reveal a profound darkness in human spirituality, a willingness to inflict eternal suffering on innocent creatures to secure protection for ourselves. The communities that performed these rituals were not evil or sadistic. They were desperate, terrified people seeking any possible defense against supernatural threats they believed were absolutely real. Yet their solution created a different kind of horror, one that might persist to this day in the foundations of churches still standing across Europe. Modern visitors to these historic churches walk unknowingly over these buried guardians, passing through doorways where black dogs were sacrificed centuries ago. The stones beneath their feet contain not just mortar and sand, but the remains of animals transformed by ritual and belief into something other than they were meant to be. And if the countless witness accounts hold any truth, some of those transformed creatures are still there, still watching, still guarding, still trapped in an obligation they never chose and can never escape, eternal prisoners masquerading as protectors in the darkness beneath sacred ground. The whispers of a single black dog at a crossroads pale against what comes when the sky itself opens to release an entire pack. This is the wild hunt, and when it rides, it heralds not the death of one person, but the destruction of nations. Throughout human history, across cultures separated by vast oceans and millennia of time, people have reported the same terrifying phenomenon. The sound arrives first, carried on storm winds and through empty skies. The baying of hounds, dozens of them, their voices intertwining in an otherworldly chorus. Then comes the thunder of hooves, not on earth but above it, shaking the very air with their passage. And finally, if the witnesses are unfortunate enough to look up, they see them. Spectral riders on phantom steeds, racing across the clouds with a pack of massive black dogs running before them, hunting something no mortal can perceive. The ancient Norse called it Odin's hunt, the Allfather himself leading the procession of the dead across the winter sky, his 8-legged horse Sleipnir galloping through the aurora borealis. The hounds that ran before him were said to be the size of calves, their eyes burning with the light of dying stars. To see Odin's hunt was to know that war approached, that the fields would soon run red with blood and the ravens would feast on the fallen. In Wales, they knew them as the Cwn Anon, the hounds of Anon, servants of Aran, the king of the other world. White they were said to be, with red-tipped ears, their baying growing softer as they drew closer and louder as they receded, an acoustic paradox that marked them as creatures not bound by natural law. The Welsh hunters who heard them understood the message. Death was coming, not for one, but for many. The dogs were gathering souls for their master, and they needed space in their master's realm for what was about to occur. In England, the hunt wore different names in different regions. Gabriel's hounds in the north, the Yeth hounds in Devon, the wished hounds across the moors. But the description remained eerily consistent. Large black dogs, sometimes 7, sometimes more, running alongside spectral huntsmen. Their appearance presaged catastrophe on a scale that would reshape communities, that would leave villages empty and families shattered. The consistency across cultures is what transforms this from mere folklore into something more disturbing. How did the Vikings and the Welsh, the Germans and the English, all independently arrive at the same vision? A pack of supernatural dogs accompanying riders in the sky, announcing coming disaster? The psychological explanation suggests a collective human need to externalize our fear of inevitable catastrophe, to give shape and form to the dread we feel before plague or war or famine. But this explanation struggles against the weight of specific, detailed accounts from witnesses who had no knowledge of similar sightings thousands of miles away. August of 1577, Peterborough, England. A storm unlike any in living memory descended upon the town on a Sunday morning as church bells called the faithful to worship. The sky turned black at mid-morning, and lightning struck repeatedly, so frequently that the intervals of darkness were briefer than the moments of illumination. Then the witnesses saw them. Dozens of people, stepping from their homes to investigate the apocalyptic weather, reported the same sight simultaneously. A pack of massive black dogs running through the streets as if pursuing invisible prey. The dogs moved with purpose and coordination, their movements synchronized like a military unit. They were described as being as large as small ponies, their coats so black they seemed to absorb the lightning flashes rather than reflect them. Their eyes, according to the witnesses, glowed red like forge coals. The pack ran the length of the main street, then vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, not fading gradually but winking out of existence between one moment and the next. The witnesses stood in shocked silence as the storm began to abate. Within a week, the first cases appeared. Plague had come to Peterborough, a devastating outbreak that would kill nearly half the town's population over the following months. The black dogs had been heralds, an advance warning that the community chose to record but could not comprehend how to heed. The account might be dismissed as hysteria, the traumatized memories of a population seeking supernatural explanation for natural disaster, except that Peterborough was not alone. That same storm, that same day, another pack was sighted in Bungay, a town some miles distant. The details matched so precisely that historians have struggled to explain the correlation. Two different populations, no communication between them until days later, reporting identical phenomena on the same date, followed by the same plague outbreak spreading across the region. The wild hunt fell silent for centuries in the historical record. Sightings continued. Locals whispered of the phantom pack, but few accounts made their way into official documentation. The Industrial Revolution brought smokestacks and railways, and the sky became crowded with new sounds that might mask the baying of supernatural hounds. The world convinced itself it had moved beyond such superstitions. Then came 1940, and Britain stood alone against the darkness sweeping across Europe. The Nazi war machine had conquered France, and now turned its attention across the Channel. In the autumn of that year, as the Battle of Britain reached its desperate climax, reports began filtering in from across the English countryside. People heard them in the nights before major bombing raids. The sound of hounds, packs of them, baying in the empty sky. Witnesses described lying in their beds, listening to dozens of dogs howling overhead, followed by the thunder of hooves on cloud. The sound would last for minutes, sometimes as long as half an hour, then fade into the distance. In the morning, the bombers would come. A retired schoolteacher in Kent documented the pattern in her diary. She heard the Phantom Pack on the night of September 14th. The next day, the Luftwaffe conducted one of its heaviest raids on London. She heard it again on the night of October 14th, and the following day Balham Underground Station suffered a direct hit, killing 68 people sheltering there. On November 13th, she wrote that the hunt had been the loudest yet, the sounds so clear she could distinguish individual hounds in the pack. The next night, Coventry burned. A RAF pilot stationed in East Anglia told his commanding officer that he and 3 other men had heard the hunt on the night of November 28th. They were outside the barracks, smoking and watching for German aircraft, when the baying began. He described it as the sound of every hunting dog he had ever heard, amplified and overlaid, echoing from a sky that contained nothing but stars. The hounds seemed to be pursuing something eastward toward the coast. The next day, Southampton suffered a devastating raid that destroyed much of the medieval city center. The British government suppressed these accounts. In a nation fighting for survival, the last thing the civilian population needed was the belief that phantom omens were predicting their destruction. The reports were classified, buried in files that would not surface for decades. But the witnesses knew what they had heard, and many of them, in private journals and letters, recorded their conviction that something beyond human understanding was marking the sites of coming catastrophe. The wild hunt, it seemed, still rode, and where it passed, death followed in numbers large enough to reshape the landscape of nations. The phenomenon has not ceased with the ending of world wars. 2001, March 16th. A clear, cold night on the A9 motorway in the Scottish Highlands, between Inverness and Perth. Over the course of 40 minutes, 7 different drivers contacted police to report an emergency on the roadway. A pack of enormous dogs, black in color, had crossed the motorway directly in front of their vehicles. Multiple drivers reported collisions. They described the sickening impact, the sense of hitting something substantial and solid. 2 drivers stopped immediately, certain they had struck and killed animals. 3 others slowed but continued, reporting the incidents from their mobile phones. Police responded within minutes. They searched the entire stretch of roadway where the sightings occurred. They found nothing. No bodies, no blood, no fur, no evidence that any animal had been present. One officer noted in his report that the guardrails and roadside vegetation showed no signs of disturbance, despite drivers insisting they had seen the dogs emerge from and disappear into the brush. 2 of the vehicles were examined for damage. Both showed minor front-end damage consistent with collision, but forensic examination found no organic material, no evidence of contact with living tissue. The 7 drivers did not know each other. They were traveling in both directions on the motorway. Their reports came in independently over nearly an hour, yet their descriptions matched with disturbing precision. Between 6 and 9 dogs, each the size of a large deer, black-coated, moving as a coordinated pack. Eyes that reflected headlights with an unusual reddish glow. Movement that seemed almost fluid, as though the dogs were running through water rather than across asphalt. 3 weeks later, an outbreak of foot and mouth disease began in Scotland. The first case appearing less than 20 miles from where the Phantom Pack had crossed the motorway. The outbreak would become the worst agricultural catastrophe in British history, resulting in the culling of over 6 million sheep and cattle, devastating the rural economy and fundamentally altering farming practices across the nation. The wild hunt, according to the accumulated testimony of centuries, does not announce the death of individuals. That task belongs to the solitary black dog at the crossroads, the lone phantom that appears to mark one person for the grave. The hunt serves a different function. It is a herald of collective catastrophe, of disasters that reshape communities and nations. Where the lone black dog appears before car accidents or heart attacks, the wild hunt presages bombing raids and plagues, agricultural collapse and warfare, events that kill in numbers large enough to echo through generations. This distinction may explain the terror the hunt inspires, a fear that transcends the normal human dread of death. We can, to some degree, accept our individual mortality. We understand that each of us will die, and while we may fear that death, we can contextualize it within the framework of human experience. But collective catastrophe operates on a different psychological level. It suggests that the universe itself has singled out our community, our nation, our moment in history for destruction, on a scale that will erase not just individuals but entire ways of life. The Wild Hunt tells us we are not in control. It tells us that forces beyond our understanding or our ability to influence have already decided our fate. The bombing raids will come. The plague will spread. The disaster will unfold, and all we can do is hear the phantom dogs baying in the empty sky and know that our world is about to fundamentally change. The accounts continue into the present day. Witnesses still report hearing the hunt, still describe the coordinated pack and the sounds of spectral riders. And in the aftermath, investigators trace the pattern. Natural disasters, industrial accidents, outbreaks of disease, moments when the fabric of a community tears and cannot easily be repaired. The correlation may be coincidence, the human mind's desperate attempt to find meaning in chaos. Or it may be exactly what the witnesses claim. A warning, delivered by creatures that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we cannot explain. That collective tragedy has been set in motion and cannot be stopped. When you hear dogs baying in an empty sky, the old stories suggest you should not fear for yourself alone. You should fear for everyone around you, because the hunt has marked your moment in history, and catastrophe rides behind it. We return now to the question that haunts every page of this investigation. How did cultures separated by vast oceans and thousands of miles, cultures that never traded goods or exchanged words, all independently conclude that death walks on four legs with eyes that burn like coals? The physical evidence refuses to dissolve into comfortable explanations. In 1597, at St. Mary's Church in Bungay, England, something left scorch marks on the stone and wood. These marks exist today. You can visit that church, run your fingers along burns that no natural fire could have created in those precise patterns. 2 men died that morning. Their deaths were recorded in parish registers that still survive. Whatever entered during that thunderstorm left traces that have endured for over 4 centuries. The remains found in ritual burial sites across Britain tell their own unsettling story. Canine skeletons positioned at property boundaries, buried with deliberate care at crossroads and thresholds. But some of these bones belong to animals far larger than any known dog breed of their time period. Archaeological reports document skulls and femurs that suggest creatures of impossible size. These aren't fossils from prehistoric eras. They're buried alongside artifacts from the medieval period, sometimes with iron chains still wrapped around the bone. In Oedidate, Japan, archaeologists uncovered similar ritualistic burials. Dogs interred with ceremony and honor at village boundaries. The practice spans centuries, all designed to create spiritual guardians at liminal spaces. The Japanese had no contact with Celtic Britain during the periods when both cultures were burying these threshold guardians. Yet both arrived at identical conclusions about what death required and where those protectors needed to stand watch. The consistency of witness descriptions across time and geography defies easy dismissal. The glowing eyes appear in accounts from ancient Mesopotamia to 20th century America. Not just bright eyes, but eyes that shine with their own internal light, often described as red, sometimes green, occasionally blue, but always luminous in darkness. The sulfurous smell accompanies sightings from Wales to West Africa to the American South. Different languages, different belief systems, identical sensory details. Modern sightings include multiple witnesses observing the same entity simultaneously. In 1937, more than 50 people in Louisiana reported seeing a massive black dog with glowing eyes near a bridge where a fatal accident had occurred days earlier. These weren't isolated individuals reporting dreams or hallucinations. These were crowds of people who saw the same thing at the same time and corroborated each other's accounts without prior collaboration. Science offers explanations for some sighting. The human mind under stress produces hallucinations. Folklore spreads through cultural transmission. Ordinary animals in poor lighting conditions appear strange and threatening. Sleep paralysis creates vivid encounters with dark figures. These explanations hold truth and deserve consideration. But they cannot account for the physical evidence. They cannot explain the scorch marks or the oversized remains. They cannot address why 50 people simultaneously hallucinate the same specific entity with identical features. The question of what hellhounds actually are remains suspended between possibility. Are they psychopomps, guides who shepherd souls from life to death? The Greek Cerberus guarded the boundary between worlds, preventing the dead from returning and the living from entering prematurely. The role wasn't merely punishment but cosmic order. Perhaps these entities serve similar functions, appearing when death approaches to ensure proper transition. This would explain their presence at deathbeds, accidents, and places where the boundary between life and death has worn thin. Or are they hunters, demonic entities seeking souls to claim? The Christian interpretation of black dogs as diabolic servants suggests malevolent intelligence and hostile intent. Yet many accounts describe the creatures as more observational than aggressive, watching rather than attacking. They appear, they stare with those burning eyes, and they vanish. Their presence terrifies, but often they harm no one. The terror itself might be the point, or it might be a side effect of encountering something fundamentally other than natural reality. Perhaps they are something else entirely, something for which we lack adequate language or framework, entities that exist in dimensions our science has not yet mapped. Consciousness that takes form at the intersection of belief and reality. Guardians created by collective human need, given shape by millennia of fear and reverence, and desperate hope that death has rules and boundaries and watchers who enforce them. The clustering of sightings around liminal spaces presents another layer of mystery. Crossroads appear in Hellhound accounts worldwide. Not just any crossroads, but specifically those associated with executions, accidents, or ancient boundaries. Bridges serve as frequent sighting locations, those structures that exist between one place and another, suspended over water or void. Thresholds of homes, the literal boundary between inside and outside, private and public, known and unknown. Twilight hours when day transitions to night, neither fully light nor completely dark. These liminal spaces exist between states. They are neither one thing nor another. Dawn and dusk occupy the threshold between day and night. Crossroads belong to no single direction. Bridges connect but also separate. Perhaps these threshold spaces create conditions where entities from elsewhere can manifest. Perhaps the boundaries between worlds grow permeable at places and times that exist between categories. Traditional folklore across cultures recognizes these vulnerable moments and locations. Japanese tales warn of encounters at dusk, calling it the hour when demons walk. Celtic mythology describes the power of crossroads as places where the veil between worlds thins. Scandinavian folklore cautions against standing on bridges at twilight. Different cultures, identical warnings, all centered on thresholds and transitions. Every attempt to investigate these phenomena scientifically confronts the same frustration. The encounters resist replication. They occur unpredictably without warning, often to witnesses who weren't seeking supernatural experiences. The entities appear and vanish without leaving traces that satisfy laboratory analysis. Yet, the scorch marks remain. The bones exist in museum collections. The historical records document deaths and sightings, with dates and names and details that anchor them in verifiable reality. We are left with questions that refuse resolution. The evidence suggests something genuinely anomalous while resisting definitive conclusions. Perhaps these entities exist precisely in that space between myth and reality, manifesting when conditions align, when belief and location and moment create temporary doorways. Perhaps they have always existed in those gaps, appearing throughout human history whenever and wherever the boundary between worlds grows thin enough for something to push through. The final haunting truth transcends individual accounts and physical evidence. Every major culture independently decided that death required guardian. Not some cultures. Not most cultures. Every culture that developed complex belief systems around death and the afterlife included threshold guardians in those systems. And every culture, without collaboration or contact, agreed on specific details. These guardians walked on 4 legs. These guardians had eyes that burned with unnatural light. These guardians appeared at boundaries and thresholds. These guardians inspired terror in those who encountered them. This universal agreement suggests something deeper than folklore transmission or psychological projection. It suggests that humans across geography and time have encountered something real, something consistent, something that appears wherever death walks. We may never know with certainty what these entities truly are, but the evidence argues persuasively that they are something, that the countless eyes that have witnessed burning gazes in the darkness were not all mistaken or deluded or lying. The guardians wait at the threshold still, patient and eternal. They watch from crossroads and bridges, from doorways and twilight boundaries. Their eyes glow in the darkness, just beyond human vision, just past the edge of what we call the natural world. And perhaps that is where they have always been, where they will always be, standing watch at the places where one world ends and another begins. The question is not whether they exist. The question is what happens when we finally cross the threshold they guard, when we learn firsthand what those burning eyes have witnessed since the first human drew breath and the first guardian appeared to watch them take their last. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.